Hi, this is Michael Gourlay, and I want to talk about how to make smooth and performant particle trails behind fast-moving objects. So let's look at this video from a game that I've been working on. Notice that the tank fires a rocket, and behind that rocket is this trail. Also in the background is some sort of satellite, and it also has a trail behind it. How does this work? The rocket has two different kinds of particles that are left behind the rocket. One of them is flame particles, and the other one is smoke particles. In this cartoon view, I show you kind of a schematic diagram of how that particle system is set up. So first of all, there are the flame particles, and they shrink over time and add light to the scene. And then there are smoke particles that grow over time. They also rotate a little bit to give more of a sense of movement, and they block out light. They also last longer. That sounds easy. Is there anything tricky about this situation? Yes, the details matter. For example, how many particles should you emit? How big should the particles be? Where should you emit them? How far apart should the particles be from each other? What happens if you emit too many of them? What happens if you emit too few of them? What happens if the rocket changes speed while it's moving? And what about if the rocket changes course over time? Any of these issues, if done wrong, can ruin the look or feel of the experience. So let me walk you through it. First of all, what is a particle? You can think of a particle as a blob with position, velocity, size, orientation, angular velocity, and a few other simple physical properties. How is that useful in a video game? Games can simulate and draw lots of particles. So even though each particle is simple, their operations are very fast, and drawing them is very simple and fast. So even though each individual particle is simple, in aggregate, they can make some pretty interesting and complicated looking behaviors. And with some tricks, you can make just a few particles seem like they fill up a lot of space. So how does this all work? The first thing you have to do is actually simulate the particle behavior. So for each frame of the simulation or game, you update the physical properties such as velocity, which you update by just multiplying acceleration times the time step and adding that to the original velocity. Then you do basically the same thing for position, and you can also update the size and orientation of the particles as it evolves over time. That's how particles move or evolve over time. But how do you draw them? You could draw particles as complicated 3D models, but then that wouldn't be so fast. So instead what you do is you draw each particle as a quadrilateral, which is really just a pair of triangles. And computer graphics processing units are very good at drawing triangles. So there's only one other trick that you need to know, which is in order to make each of these quadrilaterals look as big as possible and therefore have the sort of biggest bang for the buck, you want that quadrilateral to face the camera. So in this diagram, you see a camera that's facing the quadrilateral, or that the quadrilateral is facing the camera. And then the question is, how do you actually write the formula or the algorithm to draw this camera-facing quad? The answer lies in recognizing that the camera establishes a kind of coordinate system, where the camera has a rightward direction and an upward direction. It also has a forward direction, but in this instance, that's not actually the most important part. So what you do is you draw that quadrilateral such that its rightward direction aligns with the camera's rightward direction, and the quadrilateral's upward direction aligns with the camera's upward direction. And then the quad seems to take up as much space as it can given its shape. A quad by itself isn't very interesting. So what you normally do is you apply an image to that quadrilateral, and those images are called textures in computer graphics speak. And the way you think of it is just like with a billboard where you apply a decal to the billboard's frame, and that makes each particle look more interesting. So let's put this all together. So just as I mentioned before, an individual particle has some simple physical properties such as position, size, velocity, and so on. And then if you have a bunch of particles, you can call that a particle set. And each particle has operations, and the operations include things like emitting new particles, changing them or moving them or evolving them over time, drawing them, and eventually killing them when they're too old or too small or too many of them. And then you can chain these operations together so that each particle has a series of operations that it undergoes. You combine the set and the operations together, and you can call that a group. And you can think of that as a layer in an effect. And you can have an effect that has multiple layers, and we can call that a particle system. So in this example, we have two layers. One of them is the flame layer, and the other one is the smoke layer. Furthermore, the system has to know how to place those particles, and so we have this additional concept called a locator. And what we do is we attach that locator to some other game object, and that's how the system knows where to emit new particles. We'll come back to locators in a second. Finally, you put all this together into a particle system manager because more than likely you're going to have more than one effect going on at a time, and the manager just updates all of the effects and orchestrates them. The rest of this talk is mostly about how to emit new particles and where to put them. So, for example, we're going to be leaving those particles behind the path of the locator, but that turns out to be slightly more intricate than it might originally sound. In particular, when we talk about the locator path, we have to deal with the fact that the locator is skipping around instead of moving continuously. And we have to figure out what to do about the gaps in between where the locator was in the previous frame and where it is in the current frame. There are lots of pieces here, but each one of those pieces seems pretty easy, and it usually is. But now we've come full circle to where we have to talk about the details, because it's pretty easy to emit and render particles the wrong way. It turns out that there is no one right way to do it. So in the rest of this video, I'll talk about a few different ways of doing it. First, let's talk about a couple of different rate schemes. And by that I mean you're going to emit particles in a couple of different ways. One of them is to emit a fixed number of particles per unit time. So it might be like 5 particles per second or something like that. And that's useful mostly when you have objects that are stationary or moving really slowly. And that could be something like a campfire, something like that. That's not the subject of this video though. The other way that you can think about emitting particles is to emit a fixed number of particles per unit distance. That makes more sense for fast-moving emitters such as rockets or satellites in orbit. So we're going to talk about using emitting per distance for this rocket trail effect. So let's look at how that might work. Here's the naive way to emit particles over distance, and that is without interpolation. I haven't told you what interpolation is yet, but it'll be clear in a second. So as I mentioned before, each particle system has a locator that is attached to the body that emits the particles. In this case, that is a rocket. And in this diagram, you can imagine that over the period of 4 frames, a rocket is going to move in a cycle. First it'll start on the far right, then it'll move to the top, then to the left, then to the bottom, and then it'll repeat. And if all the particles are emitted in the most naive way possible, here's what happens. First, at the first frame, a particle will emit where the locator is. And in fact, if you emit 10 particles, 100 particles, 1,000 particles, they all end up in the same spot. And in the next frame, all of the particles end up where the locator is on the next frame, and so on and so forth. And what you end up with is what looks like 4 particles. It doesn't matter how many particles there are, because they're all getting emitted in the same place. So what ends up happening is there are huge gaps between the particles. Or phrased differently, there are huge gaps between the previous and current location of the emitter on each frame. So that looks bad. What can we do? One of the ideas that we're going to explore is filling gaps between the locators by using subframe interpolation. The idea is, at each frame of the simulation, we're going to calculate the trajectory that probably the locator took between the previous position and the current position, and then we're going to emit particles along that path. It's important to remember that the trajectory that we're computing here is not unique. All we know is where the locator was before and where it is now, and there could be an unbounded number of paths between them. In fact, one of the paths that could happen is that it just teleported in space from the previous location to the current location. But we probably expect that that trajectory is going to be very smooth. So let's look at different ideas about how we can fill in those gaps and see how we like them. So let's try the simplest gap filling technique, which is to use linear interpolation. So once again, at the first frame, the locator is at a certain spot, and then on the next frame, the locator is at a different spot, and what we do to connect the dots is just draw a straight line. So now we don't have gaps between the two locator positions. We have a nice contiguous looking stream of particles, and it looks better. And we keep doing that. So in frame 2, we again connect the dots with a straight line, frame 3, and so on. And now instead of having huge gaps, we have a nice filled in look to it. There's one problem though. This looks better, but it also looks kind of jagged. So let's try something else. Let's try smoothing out that trajectory. And again, all we know in this version is where the locator is at each frame. So again, at frame 0, it's on the right, and at frame 1, it's at the top. And here, instead of connecting the dots in the straightest path possible, we'll use some sort of smoother trajectory. And the way that we get that smoother trajectory is by actually keeping track of not just the current and previous frame, but also the previous frame. And so after having 3 of these, you get this kind of sense of which direction the particles were coming from, or which direction the locator was coming from. And as you complete the cycle, you get a smoother path. So this looks a lot better certainly looks a lot better than having gigantic gaps. It looks better than having straight lines that are very jagged. And it looks pretty smooth. This is kind of nice. It looks pretty okay. I'm not going to go through the math in this video, but I did want to leave a slide that talks about the math. You can go and read about Lagrange polynomial formulas elsewhere. I did a little bit of additional math here to exploit the assumption that these frames will be uniformly spaced in time. And also here's a little bit of code that you can look at by freezing the video if you want to later. And then here's a giant pile of code that is actually how these particles were emitted. I'm not going to talk through this, but you can pause the video and look through it if you find that useful. There's one other interpolation technique that I want to talk about. And this one exploits the idea that you might actually know what the velocity of the locator is at each frame. And if you know that, you can compute a trajectory using both the velocity and the previous and current positions of the locator. And what you end up with looks pretty good. There's only one problem. It changes the API. So in all of the stuff I've talked about before, the API only needs to know where the locator is at each frame. In this case, you have to know both where it is and also the direction and speed that it's traveling. That might seem simple, but the problem is you don't always know what the velocity is of a locator. You might only know where it has been in the current and previous frames. And that, you can always say, well, you could always estimate what the velocity is, but that's essentially what the Lagrange polynomial is sort of doing anyway. So although this one looks better, it does require an API change. It's somewhat interesting, but it's not the one that I'm going to go with. Let me talk more about how this formula works and also why it is that I call it reverse ballistic. The basic idea is this. You're going to have this info. The current locator position, the current locator velocity, and this is the part that requires the additional API parameter, and then the previous locator position. And the way that works is you're just going to, the system will just store that information based on the information that was passed in the previous frame. With that information, you'll go through these steps. First, you're going to solve for a quadratic trajectory. That might sound fancy, but it's actually pretty simple. And the idea is that that trajectory will pass through both the previous and current locator positions with the additional constraint that the final velocity, meaning the velocity at the current time, is the one that was given by this API. That establishes a single equation that you have to solve for one parameter, which is acceleration. And here's the algebra is done for you, where you can just plug and chug. You can compute the acceleration given all these parameters. And then once you have that acceleration, you can compute a subframe trajectory along that ballistic path. Why I call this reverse ballistic is what you actually do is you start from the present and march from the present into the past. So you end up filling in the gaps going backwards. And this is the formula that you get for that, which is x of t is the position of the particle at a given time, and that time t takes values going from 0 to the time step duration. And notice that the velocity and acceleration terms here are negative, which is the part where time is going backwards. So the API for that one isn't ideal because it requires an additional parameter. So I think it's an interesting technique, but ultimately not the one that I went with. Here's a comparison of all the techniques we just covered. The first one that we talked about was not using any interpolation at all, and that's this magenta circle thing, where the particles just emit naively wherever the locator is at each frame. The result is you get huge gaps between the different locator positions. We looked at the linear interpolation technique, which fills in those gaps using the easiest gap filling approach, which is just to do linear interpolation between each locator position. We also looked at this reverse ballistic technique, which is the orange circles in this diagram. And if what you were looking for was the smoothest possible path, which is denoted by the circle with the white lines and white dots here, then the reverse ballistic approach seems like the best one. The only problem was it required additional information that none of the other techniques require. And even if you have that some of the time, you don't have it all the time. So it's useful to have a technique in your back pocket that works given only positions. And the Lagrange technique has that property, which is that it only requires knowing the positions of the locators on each frame. And by the way, it looks pretty smooth. And this diagram shows kind of a worst case scenario where the locator is taking a 90-degree turn on each frame, which is not normally what happens. So in practice, the Lagrange polynomial interpolation technique actually looks plenty smooth enough. And because its API is the same API as all the rest of them, the linear and no interpolation cases, that's the one that I am going with, and it's the one that I recommend that people use. So far, we have a situation where all the particles are where we want them, namely that there aren't gigantic gaps between the spaces where the locator was in the previous frame and the current frame. Seems like we're done. There's one problem. Filling all those gaps emits too many particles. For very fast-moving objects, subframe emission will fill those gaps with just a huge number of particles. Way too many particles. That will cost a huge amount of CPU and GPU time, and usually visual effects in video games have a pretty small budget. Like a pretty small fraction of the total budget of a video game is for particle effects. So what you need to do is actually emit fewer particles. So this seems like we're going all the way back to the beginning, which is to say, if you're only going to emit a few particles per frame, there are going to be gaps between those particles. So what we're going to try is filling those gaps with fewer, larger particles. We're going to emit a small, fixed number of particles, usually one per frame. Notice I'm saying per frame, not per time, not per distance. And you might say, isn't emitting per frame the same as emitting per time? Usually yes, if the frame rate is very, very consistent. But there's an important difference here, which is we're saying even if the frame rate is not consistent, we're going to emit a fixed number of particles per frame. And then what we're going to do is stretch those particles along the locator path. So that way the particles are larger, but only in the direction that they need to be. There's one subtlety here. Notice that the particles themselves don't have to be moving, so I'm not talking about stretching the particles along their motion path. I'm talking about stretching the particles along the path that the locator takes. So this will work even if the particles themselves are stationary. So the idea is, and the difference between those two concepts is, in one case, you're simulating motion blur, which is the idea that across an individual frame, a particle will move, and so you would stretch the particle to cover the distance that the particle would travel in a given frame. But that's not what this is. This is something different, which is this is saying we can't afford to emit a bunch of particles, so instead what we're going to do is stretch a fewer number of particles so that they effectively take up the space that a bunch of particles would take up. In the end, it looks about the same, which is that you have stretched particles, but there is an important fundamental difference between the reason between those two, that you would do those two things. And the important thing here is to know that you're stretching the particles along the locator path, not along the particle motion path. So are these particles still camera facing? And the answer is yes, but with a twist. And I mean a literal twist, and I'll explain what I mean. So this diagram resembles the one that I showed earlier in this video, which is that you have a camera and you have a quadrilateral, and you try to have that quadrilateral face the camera as much as possible. But in this case, you want to stretch that quadrilateral along the path that the locator took. And before, we looked at the rightward direction and the upward direction of the camera, but here we have an additional constraint, which is that that quad is only allowed to pivot about the axis that it's stretched along. But with that constraint, we still want the quad to face as much as possible towards the camera. So what we do is we draw one dimension of the quad aligned along that stretched direction, and then the other direction, what we try to do is align it as much as possible with the camera upward direction. But the math behind it is a little bit different than before. I call that in this slide the ortho direction, And the way that you find that ortho direction is by taking the vector cross product of the stretch direction with the view forward direction. And that gives you the two axes of the stretched quad. And with that one small modification, you end up with these camera-facing quads that are constrained to a single axis. Sometimes people call those cylindrical quads, whereas the other ones people will sometimes call spherical quads, because that reflects the number of degrees of freedom you have of rotating these things. In order to draw these quads, we need an additional piece of information per particle, which is that axis, that stretch axis. And so what we do is we store that stretch axis within the orientation field of the particle. So the emitter needs to know about that stretch axis, and also the renderer needs to know to treat that orientation in a slightly different way. So in order to render these stretched particles, you have to make a change to both the emitter and also the renderer. Both of those changes are pretty simple, but they're also very specific to these stretched particles. Once you do that, though, you can end up with way fewer particles. They're all stretched along these axes. You end up filling the space just like you had before with a bazillion particles, but you're using way fewer particles, and it costs much, much less. So here's an example where that satellite streak uses a very small number of particles. And in this frozen frame, you can kind of tell that each one of those particles is elongated across the distance that would be covered by otherwise a large number of particles. And by the way, this is a good example of where if you were worried that using linear interpolation or Lagrange polynomial interpolation isn't smooth enough compared to that reverse ballistic, well, this satellite is moving pretty fast. It goes around the entire planet once a second. And if you study it and really scrutinize it, you can tell that each one of these segments is a straight line. But when it's moving around and there's all kinds of stuff going on in the game, you don't really notice that, and it looks smooth enough. And the cost savings is so monstrous that you definitely would want to make that trade-off. So here's an example of the performance that you get from using these stretched particles. So notice in this table, the change that I'm reporting here is due to only stretching the satellite particles and only for a single satellite. So this is not where I've taken all of the rocket trails and used this stretched particle technique. This is just the savings that you get from taking one satellite and replacing its particles from that interpolated form to that stretched form. And you can see here, the change is just gigantic. Remembering that the budget here for a game that's running at 60 frames a second is that each frame should take around 16.6 milliseconds. And notice that the savings that I got here was around 7 milliseconds a frame for rendering. And if I made this same change for all of the other particles, then you would expect to see something commensurate. So here's a final comparison of all the different techniques. The first technique was not to do any interpolation at all. It was the simplest to implement, but it had huge gaps and it looks obviously wrong, and it's just not viable for fast-moving emitters. Then we used the linear technique, and that's simple. It requires only knowing the previous locator, and it could look jagged for very, very high-speed locator motion. In practice, it's probably not that big of a deal, but it turns out that that quadratic Lagrange polynomial is even smoother than linear. It doesn't require any additional information from the API perspective, and it looks smoother, and I felt like it doesn't really cost any more. It doesn't really require a different API, so that's the one that I implemented. Then there was that reverse ballistic technique. It's pretty interesting in a kind of academic way, but because it requires an additional parameter on the API, I decided not to keep it. And then finally, there's the stretched particles, which are absolutely essential for keeping your performance up. It fills all the gaps. It uses drastically fewer particles. It is drastically faster both for emitting and also for rendering. And the only drawback is that the stretched particles only look about as smooth as the linear approach, but that ends up being smooth enough, as you could tell from that satellite path view. The other cost, it's not really a drawback, but it is a cost, is that it does require a special rendering technique that uses particle information in a special way. And if you didn't already have a field in your particles that was storing orientation as a three-dimensional vector, you'd have to add that. But because you're drawing such drastically fewer particles, even though each individual particle is slightly more complicated, the net benefit is just huge. And there's no question it's the right thing to do when you have very, very long trails. There are other variations of stretched particles. One of them is called ribbons. It's different in important and subtle ways. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I just wanted to mention that there are other ways of kind of dealing with the same problem. It's sort of philosophically similar to stretching the particles, though. So that's the end of this video. If you're interested in looking at other particle effects, I wrote a series of articles about how to do fluid simulations for games and movies. Here's the URL. And if you're curious about this game that I showed the video of, I'm blogging about it on Facebook, so you can check that out there. Thanks.